session of the Global Energy Outlook Forum 2024 with the distinguished Jorge Montepicu, President and Founder of Global Markets, who I believe is in Guatemala at the moment. Yes, you are. Wonderful, because this is ultimately the place to end the day in Latin America. We've just had the last panel discussion with three gentlemen from Mexico, Venezuela, and Uruguay. So appropriate that we have a global figure such as Jorge to finish off the day and review the survey results that we've been taking through the day. But first, I wanted to give Jorge an opportunity, and I'm very keen to hear his thoughts on 2024. Looking ahead, we start the year with a relatively a sober oil market, one would say. No drama, Obama. Nonetheless, despite all the drama in the world, your thoughts as you look out to 24 and whether or how it might be different to 2023.
Well, I think it will be different than 2023, but up in the incline of dissension and political crisis among nations. If we review 2023, we have been probably in a descent. As more nations are fighting, more issues crop up. We close the year with closure almost of the Red Sea, and that situation seems to be worsened. It is very unlikely that this friction is going to end in the next 2 weeks. It will continue, right? So, and likewise, and this is one of the more perplexing, I think, thoughts we have, is that energy is really cheap relative to anything else. In previous sessions, we have discussed how if one were to compare the price of a barrel of oil and how many cafe lattes it buys, it's by increasingly fewer, meaning oil is too cheap. I am a believer in the regression to the mean. However, that doesn't give you the time. It just tells you that at some point, or either the oil price will go up or the price of cafe lattes will come down. But it will happen. And you had a session on involving a lot of Latin Americans. And because I'm in Latin America, I think it's worth to bring what the emerging world is doing. And if we compare the two centers of economic activity, East and West, they're essentially in the North. China, Japan, Korea on one side, if we take that as Asia, Russia kind of in the middle, and then Europe and the US. And frankly, all of them are struggling. And some are struggling than most, like Germany. There have been a lot of bad decisions, a lot of sanctions that hurt the sanctioner and will continue to hurt them. So this drags down the economy and thereby drags down oil consumption. At the same time, if you're in these areas of the world, and we need to focus very much on Africa and Latin America, people are not involved really. They don't know where Ukraine is really. And they don't know who Hamas is, for instance. They have no idea. They're going about their business. And in the economies of the world, even though they're very tiny, Africa is surpassing everyone. Like things that you could never imagine, that Africa on a GDP growth basis would have the best performers. Countries like Burkina Faso, they're really growing fast, or the Guyana because of oil in Latin America. But here in a small country like Guatemala, you see the vibrancy, the building. I go around and all I see, maybe one could say, it's a little bit of dodgy housing, but it's being built everywhere. So construction is booming, agriculture is booming. Somehow, and there are some theories about it, COVID was very good because it reset the economies here. They went from being really a little bit backwards to being online because COVID forced them to be online. And that means that energy demand in these countries is rising. Because the economies are small, they don't counterbalance the slowness of the developed world, but they're catching up very fast. And these things are trend-wise. The other major trend, and we start to feel the impact, is demographics. The North has started to shrink in terms of population.
Aging.
Japan is at the forefront of it, right?
Yeah.
With Korea not far behind, Singapore not far behind.
Italy, Germany.
Correct. There are just not enough children. And while we still don't feel it quite yet, the signs are there, the closures of schools, it's slowed down in the North. The growth, of course, with children is massive in Africa, but it's even slowing down in Latin America. In my trip here, I have met people from Costa Rica, and they say they are already with it's called the total fertility rate being negative. And much to my surprise, I was reading that even in Guatemala, it will go negative by 2030. So the world is resetting in a major way. As those demographics play out, and this takes decades really, it's not something that happens in 24, 25, but it tells you where we are heading. Where we are heading is the global South is rising relatively quickly versus the North. This is unstoppable. It's just happening.
Well,
But
you're seeing that ultimately in the migration challenge that is coming under to be probably the biggest political issue in the North. Let's just bring up the survey questions, because I'd like to get your views on some of the subjects that we've tackled through the 12 hours today of the Global Energy Outlook Forum and some of the survey results. I'll just start in Asia, Jorge, and obviously Asia was very much a demand story this morning. Can OPEC rely on Chinese oil demand to save the day in 2024? 2-1 no. Then we had what appetite across Asia for the Russian oil gift that keeps on giving in 2024? Is it going to be increasing, decreasing, or steady, more or less same as? Seems to have drawn the biggest attention. What is the outlook for Asian LNG demand to reclaim its global supremacy from Europe in 24? Split decision there, likely, unlikely. And then lastly, what is the outlook for general energy, Asian energy demand in 24 as China's stuck in the doldrums? Still bullish. And that was kind of the strong narrative out of our Asian sessions today, or general China is changing, is no longer what it was from an energy point of view, but the rest of Asia, speaking to your narrative of the rise, Indonesia, Vietnam, of course, India being the new sort of demand centers. Your thoughts on the outlook for Asia 24, weaker China, but demand holding. How do you see it?
Well, I think the last survey that you're showing on the screen and the first one are versions roughly of the same thing, right? But the results really point to the fact that China is not seen as the big savior and the big driver in demand. And China, you could say it topped out, and this idea has been raised for a long time. Whether China will become old before it becomes rich. And by rich, we mean with a per capita income similar to the US. Hold on a second. I need to do something here on the computer. And so China is hitting some buffers there. And I'm an economist, and I have seen a lot of intrusiveness by the central government in trying to guide the economy. When you do that, typically, and I'll use a bad term here, you screw it up, is what happens.
I mean, even to the granular end of trying to control CEOs and how much what they do. And
absolutely, absolutely. China has been running with the oomph that Deng Xiaoping gave to the economy. But eventually you run out of that momentum, right? And we're seeing the economy topping out. They need to reset. And the more President Xi does, the more he tends to slow down the economy. He needs to take a vacation insofar as the economy is concerned.
Well, that was a big event last year when he was reelected for the third time. Perhaps that move away from the historic 2 terms mightn't have been the best choice for China.
Absolutely. I, as an economist, without getting into politics, that was bad for China. And now China is paying by essentially not having the energy to move ahead. They need to be liberalized. But if we look at the rest of Asia, Japan is in the doldrums. South Korea is not booming ahead. Where it's happening is in the southern part. Indonesia is really booming ahead. So this is part of that northern versus southern boom. And it really has to do with liberalizing the economy and the entry of so many young people that want to get ahead. And now they're all technology savvy. Going back a little bit, I was reading that China, for 2 consecutive years, has less than 10 million children being born. Imagine that. For a country of that size, of 1 billion plus, to only have 10 million children being born in a year. So all these things start to grind the economies in the north relative to the south. So for the oil world, really where the focus needs to be is in Africa, in the Middle East itself, who is growing a lot in terms of population, and in Latin America. That's where it's at.
If we take the other survey questions in the idea of the Middle East survey questions, where we had the turn to being more about supply, obviously the Middle East being the region of close to 20 million barrels of oil supply a day coming out of the region. Geopolitical events are likely to disrupt oil and gas flows from the Middle East for a sustained period in 2024. 56%, I mean, a split decision, but ultimately the big dramas that are happening at the moment in the region and the Red Sea is kind of giving that some, but historically you'd have to say that history is against that particular result in the survey. OPEC supply meetings have gone from lasting minutes to lasting weeks due to the erosion in Saudi-Russian oil policy alliance. That was, 2-1 disagreed with that. But you can't disagree with the fact that they've gone from lasting minutes to lasting weeks. The reason why, we might come back to your view on that, Jorge. I'll just finish off with the Middle East survey. Gulf Arab economies and industries momentum to compete globally, which has been a big driver in recent years to go global from this region, is likely to slow down in 24 due to lower oil revenues. Split decision on that question. Okay, that was it from the Middle East. So those are some of the survey results of the Middle East. What is your thoughts on the supply center here? And let's particularly drill into the OPEC plus, because clearly that's has a big bearing on the markets for the year ahead, as it would have every year. We saw at the end of last year that this meeting that sort of took 2 weeks to put together to get to a result. And then we saw ultimately the result come out. Putin came to the region. We saw one of the African countries leave the OPEC group. So your thoughts on where does OPEC Plus sit at the beginning of a 2024?
In my opinion, they continue to be in a comfortable place as being the center of supply. Any other area, including places like Guyana, takes so many years. What we're seeing happening in Guyana is something that started more than 5 years ago. So the supply lines for new production to come in and affect the preeminent role that the Middle East has is they're too long. And where are they going to come from, right? Yes, Venezuela has a lot of oil, but they're still kind of half under sanctions or could come under greater sanctions, and they're not going to threaten the Middle East. And they're part of OPEC anyway, right? The Guyana cannot change the dial. The Central Asia cannot change the dial. Yes, Russia is drilling a lot for new oil. And despite the sanctions, I think that last year that they had the highest amount of drilling going on, but they are also working with OPEC. So what OPEC needs to do is to manage the seasonal effects like we have right now, right? We're going into the period of low demand, but we're still close to $80. So no big drama, right? And also the political and shipping issues that we are facing in the Middle East. But in a way that helps the Middle East in terms of pricing, but not in terms of its reliability as a source, which they'd like to convey that image. But to make the long story short, Middle East is good. It will continue to be the main center of supply, and no drama insofar as I can tell for 2024.
But in terms of OPEC Plus, obviously we saw this deal originate in March 2020. I mean, obviously as COVID kicked off, but ultimately Russia and Saudi dramatically fell out before they found a consensus to align. Is there a sense that their alignment might be not quite what it was? Russia needs to, it seems to me, to maximize production. Saudi needs to maximize price. And they're in their sense that is a kind of a divergence of key interests. Your thoughts on that alliance that underpins OPEC Plus?
Yeah, I think you hit it. One focuses on price, one focuses on production. And whatever thoughts there are, the sanctions do have an impact, not anywhere near what the sanctioners expected, but they do have some impact. So the tendency for Russia is to produce as much as it can. And if that damages price somewhat, well, that lowers the impact of the sanctions, but puts it square on against Saudi Arabia. So that friction is going to continue. But the two of them are aligned in terms of ironing out their differences, in terms of finding a middle ground where they both are actually optimizing revenue. So while certainly more interested in price, they still, both of them want to optimize revenue.
You certainly saw that, I mean, in terms of the importance of the relationship with Putin's first visit outside of Russia, other than to China, was to Saudi and the UAE just before the holiday season. Seemed to show how important that was. Into Europe, our European sessions, oil markets remained relatively immune to the apparent bullish black swans in 2023, whether that be in the Middle East war or others. Will that remain the same in 24, the immunity of the oil markets to, surprising events. Yes, 2-1 was the answer on that. Classic oil market fundamentals of supply and demand will trump geopolitics and black swan events to determine the direction of oil prices in 2024. Overwhelming agreement on that point. EU southern neighbors, East Med, Azerbaijan, won't wait much longer for Europe to make strategic energy infrastructure investments before they look east to develop their economies. Agreed with that point.
If you don't mind me interjecting a little bit.
Please,
here,
absolutely.
These things also have these 3 points you made have an underlying theme there, and that is the weakness of Germany. And Germany is having now social issues, demonstrations, strikes. People are getting fed up, really, because their focus has been outward to try to, in a way, solve somebody else's problems rather than looking at the problems inside of your house. And when you do that, eventually people start rising, right? So I expect Germany to start looking in. And that means to try to accelerate the internal economy rather than just letting it go as they have and shrink. And that could be one of the potential black swans for 2024. Because
it could also bring in a more right-wing populist politics.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%, right? That pendulum swings. When you don't focus in your house, but outside, essentially the swing whacks you out of power. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're seeing right now. And if that pendulum comes back in, what that means is Europe will start to grow again. And that means more oil demand. And that could mean higher oil prices. What a lot of people forget is that if energy prices are high due to a growing economy, it's actually good news. It's not bad news. That means you're doing well, right? And we could see later in 2024, not at the beginning of 2024. It's currently the situation in Europe is too weak.
Yes, it needs a new beginning. I'm kind of betting a little bit on Donald Tusk in Poland being some sort of catalyst for a new Europe momentum, because Europe has no leadership, which is, I think, a big problem. Let's just go through the remainder of the slides as we're running out of time. We have 3 minutes to finish up here. Will a switch of, this is the US now, the survey questions from the US series, will a switch from a year of monetary tightening to a year of monetary easing be bullish or bearish for oil prices? Bullish got a big win of votes there. Will the U.S. oil major shale mergers, the mergers that we saw last year in the shale patch, Exxon and Chevron buying up big shale producers in America, lead to greater capex spending and higher U.S. output levels in 24? The answer was no. That was a response on that. Biden's chances of re-election will be more impacted by price of gasoline, jobs, and inflation rather than geopolitics and foreign affairs. 3-1 answers on that.
The question is,
please,
or the answer is the economy stupid, as we heard from the Bush times, right?
Yeah. The answer that's on the climate, the idea of, is the U.S. a leader or a follower in tackling climate change? They become record oil producer last year. At the same time, they have a big climate legislation, and yet still don't seem to be a leader in the climate challenge. Finally, with a brief minute or two left, the big question, which we asked right across the day of the 12 hours, what will be the average price of Brent crude oil in 2024? Closer to 60 got 0%. Closer to 70, 34, 80, 56%, and 90, 10. Your thoughts, Jorge, on this? Obviously, the big sort of question for the average outlook for the year ahead.
This squarely has to do with the US monetary policy. I think the US, because of the elections, is really going to try to keep down interest rates at the beginning and towards the middle of 2024 because of the upcoming elections. But that means it has to increase the money supply. You cannot have the runaway debt that the US has without either allowing interest rates to rise or by printing money. Out of the two, because of the elections, the US definitely will choose to print money for at least 6 months of 2024 to help the election. And during that period, as the money supply increases, we're going to see a resurgence of inflation. And we already saw that bit towards the end of the year in Europe, where the numbers are showing inflation is not being kept down. If inflation comes up, of course, the price of lattes are going to go up, and alongside the price of oil is going to go up. It's not because of a vibrant economy, but because of the money supply. So I am more on the side of 80 to 90, even above 90 if the money supply gets out of control.
Interesting. Well, we're going to have to wrap it up there. It's been an absolute pleasure, Jorge. I'm really glad how this transpired for you to be the punctuation point of the Global Energy Outlook Forum. We're delighted you had a long flight overnight, and so your availability was at this latter end. So that's great. Really, really useful insights. Always a pleasure to have Jorge Monteagudo, President and founder of Global Markets. Have a great time at home in Guatemala. And we look forward to catching up over the year ahead on the podcast and hopefully in person at IE Week, perhaps. But thank you, Jorge.
Thank you very much.